I've suffered this all my life. That, well, at least ever since I became a conservative which was in May 1968 in Paris. Yeah. I didn't know. I hadn't a very clear idea of how to articulate it. All I knew was that when I looked down the street and saw all these rowdy students throwing stones at policemen, I just said to myself, whatever they believe, I believe the opposite.
Right.
And then I didn't know what it was. And then it was a sort of lifetime's work to find out what the opposite is. So, and I, somewhat arrogantly, came to the conclusion that it's, if you start thinking about politics in an intellectual way, you are likely to be on the left. Because that provides a systematic solution, an answer to the questions, puts it all in a system, and also gives you a rather dignified and self-congratulatory place in the system. But once you started thinking, if you think a bit harder and longer about it, you'll move back to what you would have been if you had never thought at all. You know, and that's my view as what an intellectual conservative is. It's someone who articulates the real reasons for not having reasons.
Say that again.
Someone who articulates the real reasons for not having reasons, but just feeling and doing what's right.
Right. Well, I think, you know, I think it's Yeats. Yeats has a wonderful poem, Easter 1916. And in there he has the "Come let us mock at the great that had such burdens on the mind and toiled so hard and late to leave some monument behind." He wrote that when he witnessed some Irish revolutionaries destroy a beautiful house of a very wealthy landed English, Anglo-Irish person. And in a lot of ways that poem articulates that idea that it's very easy to destroy and tear down. And I think one of the things that's so tempting for many people, because the world is so troubling to so many people, and so many people suffer in this world, and a lot of what the liberal left tends to rely on is that sense of indignation that a lot of idealistic people feel, because there are things that are deeply wrong with the world. But then when we look historically at how, when these people have gotten into power, whether they're, I mean, people tend to forget that the Nazis were actually, they were quite bohemian in a lot of ways. They had a lot of leftist politics. Certainly their economics was tended to be collectivist, and they were national socialists as opposed to being internationalists. But when they get into power, they tend to really, really tear things down and don't give us
well, I think there's an explanation of this. It's what Hegel calls the labor of the negative.
Right.
That the initial instinct on the left is that negative instinct, that things are wrong. And they must be rectified. They can only be rectified, however, by the seizure of power. And so we're going to seize power in order to rectify them. But once you've got the power, the negative is still there in your heart, because it's driven you all along. You know, that's the thing which has inspired you. So you set about destroying things, punishing people. You find classes who are to blame. You know, the Jews, the bourgeoisie, whoever it might be, and you don't get out of that negative structure.
Right.
And I feel that's what I felt very strongly in 1968. You know, that of course there are things that are wrong in France, but there are also things that are beautiful and right, and you've got to go through this and come back and rescue those things, which is much more important than destroying a few obstacles along the way.
Right. Blake has an interesting, he says, "The hand of vengeance found the bed to which the purple tyrant fled. The iron hand crushed the head, and came a tyrant in its stead." And that tends to be a pattern that we see again and again, that if you have, for instance, in Iran's a good example of that. I mean, Savak was one of the major reasons for the revolution itself, because the heavy-handedness of the Shah, his secret police, which he probably had no idea. They very often live in these silos and bubbles. But they've got, the secret police, the apparatus all comes back. and the disappearing, the people that disappear all disappear again. So I mean, this is part of the problem. But again, it's still this fundamental problem. For instance, I mean, one of the things that you talk about in Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands is the idea of power being the way in which everything is articulated. The critique is about power. I mean, Foucault's a good example of that, of somebody who just saw everything in terms of power. But there's definitely truth embodied in that, and I think that's why it's so seductive for so many people.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to deal with the fact that so many people are seduced by this because they experience, especially marginalized and disenfranchised people.
Yes, that is true. But of course, in the intellectual world, it's extremely corrupting to see things in this Foucauldian way. You know, instead of asking the question, is what Hamza saying true? I ask the question, you know, what power is advancing behind that? You know, you then disappear from the picture, right. And also what you've said disappears from
right.
the picture.
Yeah.
I'm no longer engaging with you, I to thou, at all,
right.
Because without the concept of truth, there is no real engagement between people. All I am seeing is the power that's speaking through you, and that, of course, you can look at the whole of culture in that way, which is essentially what the postmodern curriculum is,
right.
Taking one writer, one philosopher, one musician after another, and just talking about, you know, like Susan McClary on Beethoven. This is fantasies of rape speaking through
right.
this music. You know,
right.
it's extremely boring after a while because it's totally mechanical.
It's a lens. I mean, one of the things I say about critical theorists, you know, that if it was a lens, that it might be useful sometimes to just peer through that lens, but it's a corneal transplant.
That's,
you know,
that's a good metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes the only way.
Yes.
And I've seen, one of the things that I've seen with students in my own teaching experience is, you know, I've had critical theorists in my classes, and whenever they raise their hand, I could almost verbatim tell them what they're going to say, the response that they're going to give to whatever was said.
Yes.
And
well, then we need to understand why it is so seductive.
That's my point. It troubles me how seductive it's been, and it also, I grapple in my own self with the amount of genuine injustice in the world that takes place on a daily basis. And I mean, for instance, you know, their attacks on capitalism, to me, the corporate world today is so powerful, and to use a favorite term in that world is hegemonic. Mm-hmm. You know, this idea where monoculture becomes so imperious, and we've seen so many. I mean, I'll give you an example. When I was young, one of the treats in my experience was to go to a bookstore. Bookstores have pretty much been wiped out in the United States because of these corporations. So small bookstores are not able to survive. So now you had Borders, but then Borders goes bankrupt, and then now we're left with Barnes and Noble, and so if you go in, who's picking those books? Who's actually choosing what books? Like if you go, for instance, to the teen section, it's almost all about vampires and really weird occultic stuff. It's not like, you know, the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew mysteries. It's very corrosive ideas. And
we've slightly changed the topic now. We're not really talking about this postmodern obsession with power.
Right.
We're talking about change in the structure of life.
Right. But for me, a lot of, I mean, I'll give you an example. Herbert Marcuse, who I'm not a fan of by any stretch, but when I read some of his works, I was struck by real insights about things that were very troubling about American culture. One-dimensional man, this idea of a consumer and life as consumption, and losing meaning. I mean, his solutions is a whole other problem. And this is something I think that's very seductive, is that the critical aspect of Marxism and neo-Marxism has always been, it's always had a resonance in a lot of people. There's something very, very powerful about it. when you get to solutions and how we deal with these things, we're in another realm. But if I think if conservatives don't really address the real serious critiques that are there about the status quo.
Yeah, I think you're right. They have perhaps neglected those critiques, but you know, as I was saying earlier, the purely negative approach to the status quo is simply going to perpetuate this negativity, and has done. If you're not, the typical conservative, in my reading of events, is someone who looks around himself and he finds things that he loves, you know, and he thinks, well, those things are threatened, they're vulnerable, I've got to protect them. And it's not often that you find on the left somebody who looks around and finds things that he loves. It's always something that's gone wrong, something that is even hateful, and you've got to mobilize against it. If you've lost any sense that actually the world is lovable and that there are things therefore to be rescued in it, you have actually lost the sense of why there is such a thing as a community in the first place. And that, I think, is one of the things that I felt very strongly throughout my life, that there really are wonderful things that we've inherited. All Americans, however, whatever position in society they are still heirs to something rather remarkable. You know, a rule of law which goes on perpetuating itself from generation to generation. If only people knew how rare that was, they would see that they've got to fight to preserve it. You know, and the same with so many other institutions that we inherited.
I couldn't agree with you more.